Today we're going to look at Chapter 3, and Chapter 3 is all about cells. So when it comes to cells, where do we start? Well, let's start with the first plant cell that was observed with a crude microscope by Robert Hooke. He observed cork cells in 1665. Now at the time they weren't called cells, but he observed that these cork cells, they appeared slightly boxy in appearance, and that reminded him of the compartments that monks would live in. And those compartments were called cells, so that's where the moniker cell came from. But we continued on and studied cells. We had better and better microscopes, and at about the 1800s, we started to see kind of a tide changing in how we thought about where things came from. And then you had Rudolf Virchow, a German pathologist that contended that cells arise from other cells or pre-existing cells. And that was actually kind of a revolutionary type of statement or postulate because it challenged the widely accepted theory of spontaneous generation, the idea that eels can come from the sediment at the bottom of a stream, or fleas could arise from dust, or maggots from flesh. This idea that living things came from non-living things. That now has been overturned and replaced with key concepts. Those key concepts we call the cell theory, and they're roughly a collective of 4 postulates. So here they are. So first and foremost, the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of life. So when you define cell properties, you define the properties of life, because all living things are made up of cells. So that brings us to postulate 2, which is the continuity of life has a cellular basis. And then Rudolf Virchow's statement, cells arise from pre-existing cells, whether or not that be in unicellular or multicellular organisms. And you're going to see different types of cells. Again, whether it's unicellular or multicellular organisms, they'll have different shapes and subcellular components and functions. And how well an entire organism functions depends on the individual and combined activities of its parts, so of its cells. So that brings us back to the principle of complementarity of structure and function. Here are just a couple of cells, so we can see an idea of what cell diversity means. There are over 200 different types of human cells. Here we have red blood cells up at the top, epithelial cells below that. We have fat cells that have fat droplets within them, taking up so much space that they push the nucleus to the side. A macrophage, which is actually an activated monocyte that's moved into tissue to fight infection. We have some freely moving cells, like those of spermatozoa or sperm. That's a cell of reproduction. Other cells are long and cylindrical, like skeletal muscle cells, and have many nuclei, or smooth muscle cells, which are kind of spindle-shaped, meaning really thin on the ends, but kind of fat in the middle. And they only have 1 nucleus per cell. Others tend to gather information and control body functions like nerve cells that are extremely long, with these long processes called dendrites and axons. And that's just a short look at cell diversity. But let's take a step back. Let's talk about what makes up a generalized cell. Well, all cells share some common structures and functions, but we can really boil it down to 3 basic parts. A plasma membrane, sometimes called a cell membrane, but it gives the cell a boundary, separates the inside from the outside. The cytoplasm, and the cytoplasm consists of the cytosol, a fluid, plus organelles, tiny organs essentially for the cell. Those 2 things together, cytosol plus organelles, make up the cytoplasm. And that's what we're going to find inside of the cell. And then the nucleus. And in all eukaryotic cells, which are the type of cells that make up the human body, you have a nucleus that contains genetic material called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. And this is going to be a control center that contains genetic instructions for how to make proteins, the functional units of cells. So here's an overall eukaryotic animal cell. We can see the nucleus in the center. It has 3 parts. It has a nuclear envelope. It has chromatin, which is DNA mixed with protein, and a nucleolus, a dark staining region that makes ribosomal RNA. Other structures that we see that we are going to talk about in more depth are things like mitochondria, the centrosome holding 2 centrioles, lysosomes, digestive organelles, and the cytoskeleton, which consists of many different fibers that provide shape and structure and sometimes even movement to the cell. But all of that was kept inside by the plasma membrane. So that's what we're going to start with first. So make sure to watch the next video going over the plasma membrane.